speaker today, Dr. Edward Gordon. Dr. Edward Gordon is an internationally known historian, author, and speaker. For 20 years, he taught at DePaul University, Loyola, Northwestern universities in Chicago. He's presented hundreds of historical programs across America at museums, universities, and libraries, and to a wide variety of organizations and associations. His record here at the museum dates back over 20 years as far as programs that he's done for us, and we can't thank him enough. How about a hand for that? 20 years. He is the author of 20 books and over 150 articles in the area of history, business, and education. A paperback edition of his latest book, Divided on D-Day, will be coming out this spring. We do have the hardcover with us here today. You can pick up one of those today and get it signed. He's appeared on CBS Network's Early Show, CNN, PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and many other media venues. He earned his BA and MA degrees in history from DePaul University in Chicago and his PhD from Loyola University in Chicago, and also pursued postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. Only you could fix the Chicago Bears, Dr. Gordon.
Oh my God, it's impossible.
Well, short of that, how about our program today, sir?
Thank you. Okay. Hard to believe the Bears won in 1987. I remember that after spending my childhood watching my father moan and groan about the Bears losing when they played at Cubs. They were at Cubs Park, losing year after year. It is hard to believe that in 2003, I did the first program here on the Battle of Britain, the secrets of the Battle of Britain, which I have repeated, I think, twice since then to other audiences. Well, today we are going to talk about the greatest land war that ever was conducted in the history of warfare. We're going to talk about the Russo-German War, 1941 to 1945. And as General Heinz Guderian said, it's very easy to get into Russia. It's very hard to get out of Russia. And the Germans certainly proved that point, even though Napoleon had first dibs on it. Well, by June of 1941, Germany had conquered and ruled Western Europe. Hitler, however, was not satisfied with that and always had designs on Russia. Why? Well, now here we have a picture of Uncle Joe, good old Joe Stalin, smiling Joe, there you go, the man who helped murder 100 million Russians. Here's the foreign minister of Germany and the foreign minister of Russia signing a non-aggression pact in August of 1940, which gave Hitler the green light to start the Second World War. In November of that year, Molotov had gone to Berlin complaining about what Germany was doing, and Germany offered Russia a non-aggression pact and an alliance with Russia. I want you to think about that for a moment. Let's see if we can prevent this from fading in and out. So now it's still not working right. Okay. So the Germans had said to Molotov, well, we have already beaten Britain. Britain is beaten. And at that point, they had to go down into the bomb shelter because the British were bombing Berlin in November of 1940. And Molotov said to them, well, if you've beaten the British, who's bombing us? Well, obviously, they did not sign that treaty. But they did invade Poland a few days after Germany invaded. Why did the Allies only then declare war on Germany? Well, of course, they were trying to get Russia to ally with Britain and France. But Stalin thought this was just a ploy to drag him into a war and have Germany and Russia fight it out and destroy each other. So he didn't want to do that. So instead, he signed this non-aggression pact with Germany. Of course, Hitler invaded 10 countries during World War II. But after Stalin signed that pact, they proceeded and invaded 6 countries in Eastern Europe. And of course, we know what happens from 1945 onward, 50 years of Eastern Europe being enslaved by the USSR. Well, Hitler always had and intended to attack the Soviet Union. In Mein Kampf, he stated this very plainly. When we speak of new territory in Europe, Hitler said, today we think principally of Russia. This colossal empire is ripe for dissolution. It will also be the end of Russia as a state. Now, Stalin believed that Germany would invade. He was preparing to attack Nazi Europe in either 1942 or 43. So he had no faith in the Germans, and for good reason. Here is Hitler planning Barbarossa. Hitler wanted a very broad front, and he was mainly interested in economic benefits, oil, wheat, and also he needed territory for his Lieberstrom, which I'll talk about in a minute. His general staff, they wanted to seize Moscow and encircle the Red Army. They were not so interested in economic benefits. So there was a great deal of friction between the two of them. Well, here's the propaganda justification for attacking the Soviet Union that the Germans used, that Russia was going to attack them. And actually, they were correct. So the Germans decided on a compromise with Hitler, the German general staff. They would have 3 large army groups attacking the north toward Leningrad, the center toward Moscow, and the south into the Ukraine. The Germans deployed about 4 million troops, many of whom were National Socialist Nazis from other countries, which we'll get into in a little bit. Actually, for the size of the Soviet Union, the army was too small. The Germans had this 4 million man army. The Soviets had a 9 million man force, up to 400 divisions. The Germans greatly underestimated from the beginning the strength of the Soviet Union, and also its industrial complex east of the Ural Mountains. Their ability to carry on a war and produce prodigious amounts of material after the war started. So the German forces were large, but they actually were not large enough. Here is Hitler's goal, the Ural Mountains. He intended within a few months to conquer all of that territory. He also intended, for living space, to destroy its population. This was a war of annihilation. As the Germans would say, we must get rid of useless mouths. So the Germans deployed execution squads for the communist leaders and for troops. Only later would they enslave Russian soldiers because they needed them for German industry, because the war dragged out. So we're talking about a simple fact of mass murder. Those of you that are Polish, I'm sure know what happened to your ancestors in Poland. Many of them were annihilated they were included also as useless Slavs. Well, Germany was diverted from the Russian attack because Italy had attacked Greece. And we all know how vaunted and expert were the Italian army in World War II. 6 million bayonets, Mussolini called it, 6 million straw men who really did not want to fight. So the Germans had to bail out the Italians because they invaded Greece and the Greeks chased them out of Greece, and they were going to chase the Italians out of Albania. The collapse was so bad. So the Germans instead attacked Greece, actually Yugoslavia as well, which is another story. But this caused a fatal 1-month delay in the Russian campaign. Now, however, recently that has been debated that the Germans would not have been able to attack earlier because of the rain. Russia's roads were just quagmires in the rain. And as a result, they probably would not have been able to start before June 22nd. So we can debate that point. June 22nd, 1941, the same day that Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded, but he only had 500,000 troops. A 1,500-mile front. Well, let's get, how many of you have ever driven from Los Angeles to Dallas, Texas? Raise your hand. That's the front. Or from Seattle to Phoenix, or Boston to New Orleans, or Chicago to Salt Lake City. We're talking about an immense amount of space. Here is Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, announcing the attack. The Germans were shocked. The German people were shocked. He promised he would never fight a two-front war. Well, again, why were they shocked? England was not defeated. Second, they were afraid of the two-front war as they had had in World War I. So at the beginning of Barbarossa, not a single division was left in Germany. There were no more troops left. There were other troops that obviously were going to be inducted, younger men, but all the divisions were committed. However, only 25% of the German army was mechanized. You see all those propaganda movies about the great mechanization of the army. 700,000 horses supported that invasion. In fact, the Germans lost 2 million horses died in Russia during that campaign. The Soviet armed forces were unprepared, confused. Why? Well, Uncle Joe, Stalin, he didn't think Hitler would attack. Now, he had gotten and been briefed by many. Churchill sent him information that they had gotten through their own through their own code breaking, saying that the Germans are going to attack. But he didn't believe it. In fact, there's the code breaking machine, or the machine the Germans used, and the British broke their code. You know all about Enigma and all that. And the Russians were deployed near the front, but they were not deployed for a defense, but more for attack. So the Blitzkrieg in the east, here are the characteristics. The attack was led by panzer divisions, tank divisions, followed by infantry. Overhead, total air superiority, achieved the first day. The estimated time to victory by the Germans, 5 months to achieve their goals. As a result of that, cold weather clothing was only ordered for 20% of the troops who would do occupation duty after the war was over. Huge battles of encirclement wiped out Soviet armies and swept across all of European Russia. Great encirclements. Now, the Russians would learn from these tactics that the Germans deployed. And later in 42, 43, 44, 45, they tried to do the same thing to the Germans as they retreated. June 27th, Minsk falls. Look at the number of prisoners, the number of tanks captured. The panzers rolled onward, unopposed. In the first 18 days, the offensive advanced 300 miles. That's a lot for an army to move that quickly. The use of the indirect approach was what made the Blitzkrieg correct. First, infiltration. Second, being able to maneuver. Third, mechanized encirclement. The enemy found Germans in their rear, cutting their supply lines, cutting their communications, causing chaos. As a result, you can see that now Smolensk is only 180 miles from Moscow. And there was, of course, Goebbels and the German army filming it all. How many catalogs have you guys got where you can buy all those propaganda films that the Germans are showing their theaters? Something like the films we showed in our theaters showing our glorious victories against the Japanese without telling you about the casualties or showing you some of the awful photography. Total air superiority. Look at the numbers of Soviet planes. And a lot of those planes were obsolete. They were just starting to produce planes that could attack and defeat German planes. So, look at the number of prisoners that they took during that early 3.3 million. This is what Hitler said. Kick in the front door and the whole rotten structure will collapse. Well, how did they treat those prisoners? I'll tell you how they treated those prisoners. They surrounded them with barbed wire, open fields, and they let them starve to death. That's how they treated these men. Later, when they needed manpower, slave labor for factories, because they had to recruit German workers for the army, they used slave labor. There were up to 6 million slave laborers in Germany by the end of the war, producing guns, tanks, and planes. Well, now, Hitler made a fateful decision in July. He decided, first of all, he would assume the role of commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That was a big mistake. And he would move to attack the Ukraine for its grain and oil. They were so near to Moscow, but he shifted the panzers. Some went up to Leningrad, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then many moved into the Ukraine. So there you see on this map, you can see here in this photo, the shift of the armor into the Ukraine. Because of this, it delayed the advance on Moscow, and it would have disastrous impact in that winter of that year that was very severe. So now the whole Blitzkrieg moved south. Now there was already an army under von Rundstedt that had attacked, but they needed more support. That's why they moved the panzers. Did it work? Yes. There the Germans, they destroyed 5 Russian armies in the Ukraine. Captured another 665,000 Russians. Now, what's going on in the north? How many of you have been to Leningrad or now St. Petersburg? Raise your hand. Okay, it's a beautiful city. I saw some of the monuments. Very sad, all the people that died there, as we'll talk about. June 29th, Riga is taken. August the 16th, Novgorod falls. Rapid approach to Leningrad in the north. September 8th, assault on Leningrad begins. On September 11th, the Russian second line of defense is broken. And some of the soldiers, the trolleys were still running. They could have hopped on the trolley and the Germans and gone right into the center of Leningrad, and that would have been the end of the story, and they didn't do it. Why? Why didn't they take Leningrad? Hitler said, I don't want to feed 3 million Russian Slavs. Instead, we'll surround it, bombard it, and let them starve to death. Big mistake. Big mistake. Because now what happened was he was going to commit ultimately 700,000 German soldiers to keep that siege going. And those soldiers were needed for the drive on Moscow and other fronts. So, there are the 900 days. Salisbury, and how many of you read the book, The 900 Days? It's still available in paperback. You want to read about what happened at that time, get that book. It's a wonderful book. They brought up these huge siege guns. You've seen those railroad pictures of some of those giant railroad guns the Germans had. September, 5,000 shells were fired. October 7, November 11, they had 10,000 guns, 385 tanks, and 317 planes. They needed 2 tons of flour a day to feed the people of Leningrad. No way were they going to be able to get that in, certainly by air. And Lake Lagoda, when it froze, they could use it, and they did it. But many of them starved. To keep alive, they melted lipstick to fry bread. They tried to use face powder for flour to make bread. They boiled down rawhide belts. In other words, they starved. Millions starved. Many people just dropped dead in the streets of Leningrad. During the winter, they could bring supplies over the supply route, but the Germans, of course, would try to bomb that ice road. By November of 42, only 1 million people were left inside the city. The rest had either died or had been evacuated during the winter. It took until January 27th of 1944 to break the siege. By then, 700,000 people had died in Leningrad in 900 days. Hundreds of thousands of German troops were tied down, and this also changed the character of the war and certainly helped to guarantee Germany's defeat in the East. Well, now let's turn back to the Central Front. October 2nd, 1941, the troops are back from the Ukraine, the panzers are back. Operation Typhoon, which is the assault on Moscow. But 2 months had been lost now. And that winter was a very severe winter in Europe and in Russia. At first, reminiscence of the prior blitzkriegs, they encircled, they captured 90,000 Russians. October 12th, Kaliningrad. October 14th, they're over 5 weeks. They capture 1.5 million Russian soldiers. And then what happens? What happens then? Whoops, let's go back. There we go. There's General Mudd. General Mudd begins. And what does that do to the panzers? It's like glue. They can't move. They can't move, so they have to stop. It's a quagmire. October 15th, they pass Borodino, the site of Napoleon's great victory outside of Moscow in the War of 1812. There are only 60 miles to go to Moscow. October 18th, General Winter strikes. Now we have 14 days prior, very mild. Now we have sub-zero temperatures, and the blitzkrieg can't move. No winter clothing, no heavy oil for the tanks. They're asked to send supplies from all over Europe, clothing, warm food. So the French send boxcars filled with bottles of wine. They open it up, they're big red ice cubes. The bottles have broken it's so cold, and they have these big red ice cubes. So that didn't help them too much. The final assault December 5th, 1941. How many of you are from Minnesota? Raise your hands. Okay, you guys should have been there. It was only 30 below zero on that day, and you guys walk around without any coats. I've seen it myself. I know you're tough. Well, the Germans weren't that tough. Frostbite started taking a heavy toll on these troops. The panzers couldn't move. They were trying to encircle, as you see on this map, they were trying to encircle Moscow from the north and from the south. Look at that. December 5th, 4.8 miles from the Kremlin. They could see the Kremlin, this recon patrol. That's as close as they got. Guderian, who is in charge of the panzers in this attack, he said, "I could not help but think of Napoleon's army retreating from Moscow." Key is this man, Richard Storch. He was a German spy, he was in a German newspaper man who was a spy for the Russians. And he told Stalin that the Soviet Union didn't have to worry about Japan attacking. Japan was not going to attack Russia in the east. There's a long story behind that, which we don't have time to go into. So Stalin transferred 200,000 Siberian forces to the west. Here they are. And they would attack the weakened German units coming into Moscow. And the Russians attacked, and the Central Front collapsed. Hitler ordered no retreat. The Russians took up to 120 miles back from the Germans. The results of this, here are the casualties of the German army from the beginning of the campaign to March of 42. A third of their force was wiped. In March of 1942, there were 162 divisions left. This is March now of 42, German divisions. Only 8 were capable of attacking. Another 3, if they were reinforced. 47 had limited combat value. The rest were only shells of what they were. About 500 serviceable aircraft were left, and only 140 tanks could run. That was what was left of the German army. So here's the front. Take a look at it. 1942, they had pushed the Germans back from Moscow. Hitler now decided that he would continue the offensive in the south. There's the Soviet manpower. From that point on, you see these huge discrepancies in manpower. He thought in 1942, Hitler believed he could still fight a campaign and knock Russia out of the war. He thought he could use attrition to defeat the Russians, because he didn't believe the Russians had all that manpower. And of course, just the opposite would happen to the Germans, where by the end, as you'll see, they had little boys in their army fighting in the streets of Berlin. In tanks in 1942, the Germans produced 11,000 tanks. That's a lot of tanks. The Russians produced 24,000. In artillery, they produced 7,800 pieces of artillery. The Soviets produced 33,000 pieces of artillery. Well, Hitler planned an offensive in 2 phases. One was to take certain cities to prepare for the attack. The second was to launch a major offensive southward, as you see here. And at that, Krakow fell as part of the positioning of his army. And the second was Sevastopol. And, Sevastopol falls. You'll notice more prisoners of war. Now here's Hitler. Here's good old Adolf, planning the campaign. Who is that? That's von Paulus, who would command the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. He was a planner in the German General Staff, and Hitler gave him command of the Sixth Army. There's the force the Germans deployed, and those volunteers, 400,000 volunteers. They were Cossacks, Ukrainians, Romanians, Italians, Bulgarians, Spanish, French, and Dutch. All either hating the Germans, the Russians, the Cossacks, and the Ukrainians did not like the Russians. Sounds like something familiar today, yes. So, first part, attack the Caucasus. Here's the Caucasus. Why the Caucasus? Because of the oil. Germany needed oil. Most of the oil came from Romania at that point. They wanted more oil. So they attacked across vast stretches. Vast stretches. The Germans certainly had conquered France, but the distances involved are depressed and wore out the tanks and the troops. They did get to the Caucasus Mountains, but they failed to win the offensive because they were too weak. Hitler had divided his forces in two. This is only half. The other half was for Stalingrad. The oil fields they did get, the Soviets incinerated those oil fields before they got there. And then they finally were forced to retreat because of this disaster at Stalingrad, which we'll deal with now. Operation Blue was the attack on Stalingrad. The city really had no strategic importance. This was purely an ego trophy for both Hitler and for Stalin. There is the Sixth Army crossing the Don River at the end of August, after they too had gone vast distances. As this one soldier wrote, as we marched, low hills would emerge from the horizon ahead of us and then slowly sink back into the horizon behind us. It almost seemed that the same hill kept appearing in front of us, kilometer after kilometer after kilometer. Here's a Russian signpost greeting the Sixth Army on their way into Stalingrad. The attack started August 31st. The 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army, 300,000 men had reached Stalingrad at that time. September 13th, the ground assault began. There you see Stalingrad, it's all along the Volga. You see it's stretched along that long, long, mighty river. Massive air assault throughout the campaign. The Soviets feed more troops into Stalingrad bit by bit, like a meat grinder, just to wear down the German army. The panzer divisions are basically useless in street fighting in this environment. From September 13th to November 18th, violent street fighting, house by house. October 4th, Hitler orders the complete capture of the entire city. Hitler was warned that on the flanks, the Italian and Romanian armies were protecting the flanks of the Sixth Army. He was warned that the Russians were gathering large forces to try to encircle the Germans in Stalingrad. And here, there's the German propaganda. They won. The Germans announced victory. They took Stalingrad. Wonderful. Unfortunately, on November the 19th, 1 million Soviet troops, 900 tanks, sliced through those Italian and Romanian divisions. They wiped them out. I have a relative whose father was a general officer in the Italian army on that front. He survived with 2 other men and a blind horse. They finally got to a Red Cross station. He was the only one in that army group that survived. Then the Russians encircled. 22 German divisions, 250,000 men were encircled. Hitler's response: I will not retreat from the Don. Well, Göring promised he would fly in all the supplies were needed for this fortress, this new German fortress. They needed 300 tons a day. That would take 500 transports plus 200 fighter planes. They did not have that air power. They flew in less than 100 tons. Well, you can see how well equipped the Germans were for that winter. Lack of supplies gradually weakened them down. The hospitals filled with over 16,000 men suffering from frostbite and starvation. Hitler refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out. They could have broken out. They could have done it. Instead, he sent the 4th Panzer Army to break in. December 12th, they launched an attack to relieve Stalingrad. December 20th, 36 miles from Stalingrad, they were stopped cold. Hitler promises a spring relief. A spring relief. And he tells them, you can rely on me like a rock of confidence. Paulus requests freedom of action. Hitler replies, capitulation is out of the question. The army must hold its positions to the last man and the last cartridge, making this historic resistance an unforgettable contribution to the building up of a new front and the saving of the Western world. Oops. They're the panzers. They're not doing much. No fuel. Finally, on February 2nd, 1942, von Paulus surrenders. Hitler had made him a field marshal, because no field marshal in the history of Germany had ever surrendered. Hitler fumes. He should have shot himself. There are the prisoners. 13 infantry divisions, 3 motorized, 3 panzer, 1 flat, 2 Romanian, 142,000 men dead, 91,000 prisoners, 24 generals. In 1943, half would die of typhus in captivity. Only approximately 13,000 would return to Germany by 1952. Well, the goose-stepping had stopped, hadn't it? Here's the same army. It conquered France. The victory parade down the Champs-Élysées, Paris in 1940. Here they are, 2.5 years later, marching now to German prisons. Russian prisons, I'm sorry. Hitler's response, he says to Keitel, his chief of staff, create me a new Sixth Army. He said the duty of the men of Stalingrad was to die. Great supreme leader. In 1943, vast areas of Europe were still controlled by the Germans, and huge amounts of Russia. Stalin, however, had rallied the Russian people for the Great Patriotic War. There were 200,000 partisans in Russia attacking German supply lines. Next month, I will talk about the secret armies of Europe, the resistance. We'll go into some detail on that. At the Wolf's Lair, he planned a new campaign. This is his headquarters in East Prussia. All of my life, I have never been a man of defense. We will go back on the attack. Germany's alternative was to fight an offensive-defensive war. They still had massive reserves of panzers and troops, and they could have probably fought the Russians to a standstill for a long time. Or they could go on the attack. And that's what Hitler wanted, to regain lost territory. Hitler, no retreat, Adolf. We will never give up 1 kilometer. Germany in 1942, there are the numbers. By 1943, only 500,000 were eligible for the draft to replace all those men that had died. Frederick the Great was a hero to Adolf Hitler, but Hitler did not abide by Fred's #1 rule. So they were going to attack Kursk. Russian spies knew all about this. There were Russian spies in the general staff who were communists. And they leaked all the plans. So the Germans, even though they massed tremendous forces, as you see here, the Russians built layer upon layer of defense lines in that Kursk settlement. The greatest tank battle in history. There's the Tiger tank, 56.9 tons, 5-inch thick frontal armor. And then the Panther tanks. Both had 75-millimeter guns. Here's the T-34, 26 tons, 2-inch armor. However, the new German tanks were still really experimental. They broke down a lot. They needed a lot of service. And they were not as reliable. Operation Citadel, July 4th, 1943. 50-minute, tremendous artillery barrage. Hitler says that this must be the knockout blow of the war. And they made some inroads, but then they were stopped cold. The Russians had vastly superior numbers of tanks. Now here is their famous Stuka pilot, Rodel, and he used on the front of his Stuka, he had tank-busting armament. And he would fly low and he would wipe out. In one instance, he destroyed 12 tanks in one day. And for every tank destroyed by this Stuka, of course, he helped the Germans advance. The Soviets counterattacked on July 12th, and Hitler had to call the battle off by the 13th. The results was devastation. Except for minor counterattacks, the Germans never again would launch a major offensive on the Russian front. Here are the casualties that the Germans took. The Soviets lost 320,000 men in this battle. However, they could replace them. The Germans couldn't. 1943 Soviet offensive, they retake Krakow, and for the rest of that year, they gradually begin driving the Russians back. Here is a picture in 1943 of German prisoner of wars being paraded in Moscow. Later in 1943, Manstein is able to recapture Krakow and destroy some Soviet armies. He's allowed freedom of action. Hitler gives that to him. And soon after sacks him, because he doesn't want anyone to have freedom of action. He has to make all the decisions. So Hitler now is in the Weiz. That's a pretty good Soviet piece of propaganda, I think. No retreat. Fortress cities. He would build these fortress cities and stop the Russians. The Russians just bypass those cities and continue their offensives. June, October 1944, here is the strength of the Russian armies. Instead of sending replacements to divisions, Hitler would create new divisions. So on his map, he had all these divisions, but many of them were small companies. And they were poorly led, poorly equipped. This gives you an idea of when I say to you that 75% of all the casualties of World War II occurred on the Russian front. You can see the other fronts involved. The Central Front, July 1944, the Russians attacked and destroyed 28 divisions and 300,000 men. Here's part of that offensive. The Germans were forced to evacuate Odessa and the Black Sea. The Germans attacked into Crimea. This Operation Bagration basically destroyed the last major reserves of the German army on the Russian front. The effect, basically, from that point on, the Russians could move any way they wished on the Russian front. By January of 1945, there's the Russian force. Look at the superiority. The offensive that started in January, in 30 days, advanced 250 miles and ended up 36 miles from Berlin. There's the final offensive. Hitler, he wanted Lieberstrom, right? Well, there's the poster of Lieberstrom. There's his Lieberstrom. The Germans resettled the East, didn't they, with their bodies. And this is the final battle on the Russian front. Allies closing in, Americans and British from the west, the Russians from the east. For the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov is the commander. Hitler initially put Himmler in charge of the defense of Berlin, which didn't last too long. April 17th, 18th, 1945, 24 miles from Berlin, they open up the offensive and cross the Oder River. April the 19th, Hitler orders Steiner to save Berlin. He is one of the general with the small army group. Of course, he can do nothing. April 20th is Hitler's 56th birthday. The Steiner offensive collapses. Hitler finally admits the war is lost. It took him a little time to realize this. April 25th, Berlin's encircled. April 28th, the Soviet troops are 1 mile from the bunker. April 30th, Ava's dream is realized and he marries Eva Braun. And later that day at 3:30 p.m., they both commit suicide. That same day, Berlin falls. 500,000 killed and prisoners, Germans. Soviets, 81,000 killed, another 272,000 wounded. May 1st, the Berlin garrison finally surrenders. The 1,000-year Reich ends. May 7th, the Germans surrender at Rheims, France, to Eisenhower. And the Soviets make them repeat the surrender on May 9th in Berlin. There's Keitel surrendering in Berlin to the Russians and the Americans. So there are the numbers of men, soldiers, civilians who died. In fact, in World War II, more civilians died than troops, than soldiers. 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were destroyed in Russia. Another 6 million buildings, 84,000 schools, 31,000 factories. The cost of the Soviet Union, 7 million horses, 17 million herds of cattle, 20 million hogs, 27 million sheep and goats, on and on and on and on. 15,000 locomotives, 400,000 pieces of rolling stock, trains, etc. This ended the greatest land war in history. It certainly was followed by the Iron Curtain coming down on all of Europe and Stalin getting his wish of dominating Europe for 44 years. And Stalin's dream of dominating Europe still plays out now in the Ukraine, with the latest war in the Ukraine. And hopefully we will continue with our NATO allies to support Ukraine until the Russians are driven out of that nation. That is the important lesson of World War II. There will be no Munich. There will be no sellout. There will be no appeasement to aggression around the world, because that will lead to wider wars and more death. So thank you very much for your attention on this program.